Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. We're going to talk about climate and K-12 education, something that we've touched on a few different times, but maybe go a little deeper this time. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Margaret Wang-Aghania, who's the co-founder and executive director of Subject to Climate. Margaret, welcome to Trending in Education.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Mike. And it was wonderful to meet you at ASU+GSV and then now do this.
Absolutely. And there's a cat. For those of you watching video, there was a cat walking by. Don't be alarmed. It's blurred out, but no danger. But yeah, we met in person and now we're back in Zoom to record this episode. But we met while we were out at ASU+GSV in San Diego. The Lumina Foundation threw a nice happy hour, and while we were enjoying the spread, we got to catch up a little bit. But to get started for our listeners, we always like to get you to share your own origin story, how you got to this point in your career. Could you catch us up on how you got to this point?
Yeah, so actually, it really all started when I was a teacher. I was a high school social studies teacher. A lot of people think that, oh, you started subject to climate, so you must be a science teacher, but it was a social studies teacher. And even before that, I actually had always wanted to be a teacher when I was like 5 years old.
Yeah.
And the reason why I wanted to be a teacher was because I really think, and I still do, that teachers can make a tremendous impact in the world. A lot of the things that are going on in the world, you can, solve it in a classroom and inspire future generations. So, going into my first year teaching, I was very excited to do that. And then I was a first year teacher. And if any listeners are a first year teacher, they'll remember what that year was like.
Yeah.
And it wasn't all like that. It was really hard. It was one of those moments where, like, I wanted to teach about all these things that are really important to me personally, but I just couldn't get through the first year. Classroom management, just
Yeah.
trying to figure out how to do what I'm doing,
Mm.
handling parent communication, and then just even getting through the curriculum I had to teach. So,
Yeah.
by my third, fourth year of teaching, I felt way more comfortable. And I actually saw that, connecting the things that I really cared about actually helped with, being a better teacher. So I just remember my students being really engaged with the topic of climate and
Mm.
sustainability about
Hmm.
the world around them. And
Yeah.
that even students that traditionally did not pass my econ class, so they were able to actually grasp the concepts better. And I
Yeah.
also was able to lead a lot of project-based activities where they were actually doing something in their community. So that was
Hmm.
the first sort of like spark of, there's something there for climate and climate education for non-science teachers.
So that's how you started, by teaching high school?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I taught ninth grade, 11th, and 12th grade, so it was high school. That
Yeah.
was the start of the interest, but I can also go deeper into, like, what actually was, like, when we actually started.
Yeah. Carry forward. Let us know how you got to what you're doing today.
Yes, I went to Harvard Graduate School of Education thinking I was gonna do this through policy, and I actually met my co-founder at Harvard. He was doing the Advanced Leadership Initiative, which is a program for retired business people who
Mm.
are looking to pivot into social impact. And he, just like me, even though we have completely different backgrounds, were interested in the potential of education as a climate solution.
Hmm.
I spent one of my semesters doing a project where we built a curriculum, and it was very rewarding. But then when I was doing a webinar, not a lot of teachers came. And I was like, I am building something, but this may not actually fit into what a day to day teacher might be thinking about.
Right.
Luckily, my future co founder was at that webinar. So then we talked. He wasn't a teacher, so it kind of shows that, like, the webinar didn't reach, like, my intended audience. But we talked and we decided to start from, back to square one, where we just talked to teachers. We interviewed so many teachers and tried to find the biggest barriers that they face when they're trying to integrate nature, sustainability, or, topics like climate. It
Yeah.
all came back to the same thing we heard over and over again. It's not that there's not enough resources out there. There's actually a lot of great teaching resources. It's that they just don't see how it fits into what they already have to teach.
Yeah.
And then I was like, well, that is obviously the answer because that's when I felt my first year of teaching. So, sometimes you just don't make that link right
Yeah.
away. So
Mm.
that's when we decided to start Subject to Climate around 4 years ago.
Got it. And it's a nonprofit that's focused on bringing climate education into K-12. Can you talk about the mission a little bit more and really what you're trying to accomplish there?
Yeah, so our mission is to empower all K through 12 educators, all grade levels, all subjects to easily and effectively teach about climate change, action, and justice. So
Okay.
those short mission statement, but very key things I'll point out is it's not just about science teachers, very important, all teachers, because it's a very interdisciplinary topic.
Hmm.
If it was just a science issue, we would have solved it already.
Right.
There's so many dimensions. And then there's the easily and effectively part of it. So easily means like we have to make it easier for teachers.
Yeah.
And having been one, and most of my team members or former teachers or current teachers, you just can't expect teachers to do so much when they have so much on their plate. So
Right.
how do you make it easier for them?
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
then the effectively is just as important because you can't just put it in here and there. There needs to be an effective means so that, our vision statement is that students, learn about climate and then become future stewards of our planet. So what we do is we aggregate resources. So we vet them across external providers, content creators, curriculum providers, and we tag them based on the grade, subject, and teaching standard they are aligned to so that any teacher can easily look for something that fits into their classroom. And then we train cohorts of teachers and we publish their exemplar lesson plans after, revising and working through it so that you can also get an inside look into another classroom. For example, if I'm an 11th grade history teacher, what is that other 11th grade history teacher doing in their classroom in which they're easily and effectively integrating climate change? There's so many more resources, free resources on our site, but it's all centered around how do I help teachers? The last thing that we do is that we have our core free site, but we know that many states are starting to or have prioritized environmental education. So we work in different states to create customized state hubs where it's the same resources, but it's aligned to their state standards. And we add resources about their state. We train cohorts of teachers in their state and produce lesson plans about their state. So it's just the place based version.
That's awesome. And the website is subjecttoclimate.org, which I have up in front of me. And it's cool in that there's actual lesson plans that you can access directly from there. And if I heard you right, I wasn't sure. It's not just environmental standards because not every state necessarily has those, right? So, like, you're looking for state standards that can be met and lesson plans that can address a standard, but can incorporate climate related material into the lesson plan. Is that right?
Yeah, so you can search across the common standards that you'll typically hear about. So in our core platform, we look at the national standards like Common Core,
Hmm.
ELA, Common Core Math, and GSS for science, our C3 frameworks for social studies. And, when we get into the specific state hubs, that's more customized to those states. So you're right. And how that might show up, you might be thinking like, well, what does that look like? For example, if you're teaching a class, an ELA class, and you use Common Core, and let's say you're teaching ninth grade, you can still find something in the teaching resource database across different providers. But you can also go to our, what about what are other teachers doing? And, there's a great poetry analysis lesson plan for a ninth grade teacher or high school teacher and it is for ELA with Common Core, and they're looking at a poem, much what you would do in an English class. But this poem happens to be about, it's from a poet from the Marshall Islands that's writing about their culture and homeland and how they've been affected by climate change. And
Yeah.
so analyzing figurative language and imagery, much like you would already do in an
Right.
English class. And then
Hmm.
focusing on even writing their own poem, connecting to their own home and experience of climate change. So again, you're hitting those ELA standards and you're actually just making it more engaging for students because students do want to learn about this.
Yeah, it seems like it addresses the relevance problem, which is one that comes up pretty regularly in conversations that I have where, like, why am I learning this? And this is a way to connect to that why. You know, it is 2025. So the two things I kind of want to bring up, one is AI, because, you know, we were out in San Diego and, you know, the ed tech space is very excited about some of the promise of AI, although there's risks, including some climate challenges around, you know, what's the best way to use this safely in a way that's sort of conscious of conservation and some of the potential impact of this stuff. So AI on the one hand, and then on the other hand is more the culture war stuff, where like it kind of depends on which state you're in, you know, will dictate a lot about how climate is understood. Is it built into state standards, or is it something that, you know, you need to be careful about how it's navigated? I realize these are big topics,
Yeah.
but how are you thinking about those two kind of gorillas in the room?
Like, we're thinking about it a lot in our organization. We had several meetings about it, about AI in many different senses. So I'll talk about one, for
Hmm.
example. We know that a lot of schools are focused on AI literacy. They think that's really important. Students need
Hmm.
to understand what is AI, how to best use AI,
Hmm.
understand just in general, what is this technology?
Yeah, in
So
fact, when we were at ASU+GSV, the new education secretary was talking about AI, and then since then, or A1, depending on, you know, the language that was used, and then the Trump administration just issued an executive order about building AI into, you know, K-12 and
yeah.
beyond K-12, how it is in fact a priority for the new administration, which is, I guess, a ray of hope, you know, in terms of trying to incorporate stuff that we know will be relevant and we know will be supported at a federal level.
Yeah, and it is rare where you find because we have such a decentralized education system in the US. So it
Yeah.
is rare when you see not only at the federal or state level, like a lot of schools and districts are actively thinking about AI.
Yeah.
And that is really rare because to find that one common thing. And the one
Yeah.
thing that I think would be really important is as schools are incorporating AI literacy, they should also be incorporating climate literacy embedded within that.
Right.
So I'm not asking districts to do an additional thing, but doing something while they're already adopting like AI literacy.
Yeah.
So for example, we know that, you know, there's incredible energy usage. I mean, it's changing every day for using AI, from cooling the data centers through the energy that it uses. And just by mass consumption, we're just more people are using it. And that's the trend. And we need to understand that. And so while you're learning about AI, you should also be looking at it through a sustainability lens, a climate lens as well. So I think that this is actually a perfect opportunity to, not like present these conflicting, oh, you need to look at AI, you need to look at climate, you need to look at all these different things, but put it all together because
Mm.
it's the reality of what students are going to be living in. So,
Yeah. First off, it's the both and, right? It's not either or. You can actually do both of these things. But it's also perhaps even more so, I've heard, to solve complex problems like our climate crisis, we're going to need to leverage emerging technology. So, you know, folks who are learning now at, say, the K-12 level about both an AI standard, but also about climate, which is something that they want to potentially fix, those might be future engineers or entrepreneurs or, you know, educators who are actually going to be helping to solve some of these problems.
yeah, it's a tool for innovation, that's for sure. And
Hmm.
so, giving students, you know, problems coming from SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and,
Yes.
you know, looking at how can AI be leveraged. That's really important. But you also need to understand the cons of Gen AI, generative AI, and work through that and seeing do the pros outweigh the cons, how we mitigate it. So I'll
Yeah.
give an example of a lesson plan that an English teacher from Hawaii wrote during our Hawaii training program. And,
Nice.
it's a ninth and 10th grade ELA lesson. And the end result is the students are actually going to, in this unit, is that they'll be able to write in generative AI policy that they think their school should adopt.
Cool.
That's fantastic. Again, I'm not trying to add something more. Schools are already thinking about this. But in this, it's an English language arts lesson. They're in the first lesson, they're looking at generative AI, the pros and cons. They're also understanding that there can be biases in the technology tools. They also are looking at the environmental impacts of it. But, it's just looking at all sides, but they're also looking at how can generative AI be used for learning, how it can be used for so many different things.
Hmm.
Lesson 2 goes deeper into the generative AI's energy use. So it's really important to not just look at, the pros, as I mentioned, also the cons. But then the third lesson actually has them like, synthesize all of that so that they can craft what the future could look like starting in their school. So
Yeah.
knowing these, what could be a generative AI policy for your school that keeps in mind of bias and environmental impact, but also seeing it as a learning aid
Mm.
and like all the potential this innovation could provide. So,
Yeah.
you can share a link to this amazing lesson plan. I think that getting your students involved in drafting your AI policy in schools is really important. And this just shows that while you're thinking about AI, you should be thinking about climate.
Yeah. And it's great that you're able to kind of crowdsource some of your best examples and like tap into the community of practice of educators who are already kind of thinking about this stuff and solving some of these problems. Cause I've always felt like a lot of the challenges to innovating in the education space, K-12 in particular, is that the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing. Folks are very siloed and they're kind of doing amazing work maybe in their class, but they're not necessarily getting we collectively aren't necessarily getting that message out more broadly. I know you touched on it in your origin story, but you were also looking at policy. How do you think policy can kind of connect the dots here, or can it, in terms of trying to really affect change when it comes to elevating the conversation around climate in K-12 education?
I think that every state, because it almost feels like every state is a different country, will
Hmm.
have to take a different approach, and I've seen that in different states.
Mm.
But the reason why I got into education policy and went back to school and went to grad school for ed policy is because I still believe that if you're looking at changing a whole system, that
Hmm.
policy is a really important part of it because without that, you are baking on like teachers feeling incentivized on their own, which by the way, like most teachers would be incentivized, but they just have so many things going on. So policies and structures create an environment where more people at scale are going to be, for example, teaching about climate. Right
Hmm.
now, if you don't have that, you're really relying on, you know, people just finding out about it and feeling compelled to do that and having it as part of their identity, which I think is fantastic.
Hmm.
But also, you can have teachers who are like that, but don't have the support. So, for example, in the state of Maine, it's not like they're mandating climate. It's not like they're creating climate standards or doing what New Jersey did, which is updating their standards to incorporate climate. What they did was pass legislation that put in money for teachers, schools, and districts to access professional development funds for climate. So that's
Hmm.
like a different take on it. But again,
Yeah.
going back to whether it's providing incentives or providing the structures, policy allows for that. So I still think that, we can do our good fight right now, which is what our nonprofit is doing to get more and more teachers to teach about it. But again, there needs to be, infrastructure and systems in place to support that.
Yeah. And you just said systems, which is where I was going next, which is systems thinking is something that I've heard people talk about as well, where it's almost like a higher level insight that things are complex. You also mentioned, problem based learning. It seems like a little bit of both is really useful when folks have the bandwidth, when they can kind of incorporate into their teaching. And it does seem like both systems thinking and going problem based is very sort of foundational, the way I think about climate education. But what are some of those foundational components to climate education? How do you think about sort of the more systemic stuff, which is maybe a little harder to wrap your head around, but that's almost the point. Like it is going to be difficult to get there, and there's almost a higher order thinking that's going to be necessary to kind of make some breakthroughs here.
Yeah. And, I'm really borrowing from other scholars who have thought about this, where You're right. It is complex, like climate solutions, the climate crisis, and you need more than just learning about climates. You've listed systems thinking as one of the skills that students need to build. And, there's many examples of teaching resources in our database. I like the one that's a simulator where you had students negotiate different policies, but it's actually an online simulation that where you okay, if we do this type of policy, how much does it affect, like, carbon emissions, but how does that affect the other policies and other sectors? And,
Yeah.
that's an amazing teaching resource. So systems thinking is certainly one of the skills for climate action. Christina Klock is a scholar that has done a lot of work in like, okay, what are the skills we need? And we're not
Mm.
talking about, so she categorizes it in three buckets. So there's skills for green jobs, which you've heard about before. So like, data analytics,
Yep.
entrepreneurship, and, the typical things like project management. And that's great. And there's also green life skills, which are, general capacities you also need to solve the climate problem. And it's more like durable skills, whereas, what I listed before were specific skills. So,
Yep.
for example, critical thinking, and we've heard this all before, creativity. But what I love about her work is that she then went further and said that, but we need a transformation. We don't just need students to just do the job and work in a low carbon green economy, we need to transform our society if we want to see differences. And so
Mm.
she's listed a couple of transformative capacities for which she says, and I'm quoting her, adaptive skills aimed at transforming unjust social and economic structures. So one of them is systems thinking. The other one is coalition building,
Mhm.
collective action.
Mm.
And then there's like political agency, interrelational thinking, and all of these. So there's a whole list.
Yeah, that's great. And if you could send me that, I'll include a link to that info in the show notes as well. The other element to this, I guess, is hope, optimism, which is something that I've been coming back to a lot, where like, we're in the age of doom scrolling and perma crisis and, don't look up. There's a lot of pop culture stuff that kind of gets at the climate crisis, but frequently is framed in sort of catastrophic thinking, which can lead to anxiety and, lead to folks kind of checking out on some of this stuff. They just feel kind of overwhelmed. How are you thinking about that? How are you thinking about addressing kind of the whole teacher, the whole student so that they can understand the problem, but still perhaps come back to that sense of hope and perhaps personal agency around, trying to make an impact?
Yeah, actually, you've hit the right thing we have to solve because according to the Yale program on climate change communication, when people think about climate change, they're thinking like, oh, because there's so many people who don't believe in that. And that's what the issue is.
Yeah.
And when you look at the survey results, it's actually not that group that's the biggest. It's the group that are disengaged. The
Right.
group that is, they're just, as you mentioned, deactivated.
Hmm.
And so there's actually a lot of resources out there. We've put together a mental health guide with when you're thinking about teaching about climate change
Mm.
with the Climate Mental Health Network and NEEP, which is the National Environmental Education Foundation. So
Mm.
the Climate Mental Health Network has actually done a lot of work in this. They've created a mental health toolkit, and they've actually worked with teachers to see how they can help students deal with this. And
Mm.
same time, help as a teacher when you're teaching about something, you also learn it yourself, to be honest. I found that
Yeah.
as one of the most effective ways. So that's a resource. But one of the most powerful ways to work around that is or not work around, you want to address these emotions are there, you want to define them. But to make sure students aren't stuck in being hopeless, you have to, there's two methods, get students involved in some sort of climate action at the school level, at the community, or even at their individual level. So
Mm.
when students are doing some sort of action, it helps because
Yep.
it's, and we've all felt it before. If you have a problem, but you're not doing anything to solve it, you feel
Yeah.
hopeless. So
Hmm.
action's one part of it. But we also know that if you only focus on what you do as your action, you can also get pretty burnt out.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's also looking at what other people are doing as well.
Mm. Yeah. Hmm.
That's really important. And I've always said this to other people because I once heard it from Catherine Hayhoe. She's a great, amazing scientist. She mentioned that this challenge that we have is like pushing a big boulder over a hill.
Mm.
So, when you're doing it yourself and you're seeing progress being made and you're pushing it up, you're like, you get hope. But what's even more powerful is if you have other people pushing that boulder up with you,
Yeah.
it becomes no longer this insurmountable task. So I think we can do that with students. And with all the lesson plans we work on with teachers, we always have an inspire section,
Mm.
whether it's the students doing something themselves or they're learning about other people doing it.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then, I mentioned it earlier, but, I imagine at the school level, teacher level, and then up to district and state level, there is a broader movement out there of folks like yourself who are trying to make an impact. As an expert in the space, if you were to share with our audience maybe a little bit of how they can find out what's going on and who else is kind of trying to make an impact around climate, because I think you're right, where if you feel like you're going at it alone, it's a lot easier to be dispirited. But if you start to understand, okay, there's a real coalition out there of folks who are trying to activate against this. Do you have any suggestions or any advice for folks if they're trying to figure out, where the movement is?
Yes, on our site, we have a partners page. I sometimes just love scrolling through it because here are all these organizations who are doing something about climate
Hmm.
and climate education.
Yeah.
And you're going to see some logos that you recognize, but you didn't know that they were a part of this movement. And then you're also going to see how many people are actually a part of this movement.
Hmm.
So I'll give an example of the American Red Cross. I mean, you think about that, yes, disaster relief, and then you now make that connection to climate. They're educating folks on how to be more resilient to climate disasters. That's actually quite connected.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is an example of like people in the climate education space. Now, if you're talking about examples for students to give them, again, we have our teaching resource database has a lot of, you can search up, climate action or stories or solutions. And we also have partnered with an organization called The Juice to provide us news articles. And these news articles are specifically designed for reading level, differentiated reading levels between
Mhm.
12th grade. So it goes straight to the students. And they're anything to do with sustainability.
Mm.
So, sometimes when you read that news, it can be pretty, you might get caught up in like, oh, another bad news. But we
Yeah.
actually created a filter called climate solutions
Mm.
so that you can also see, things that are, new things that are coming about that people are doing that kind of bring some hope to students.
Yeah. That's awesome. And then how about looking further out? Because that's one thing that I know folks who look at climate and the environment tend to do. And that's also where folks get nervous and don't even want to look at it because sometimes the future looks scary. What's on your horizon? What do you see out there in terms of your work if it continues to go well? And what do you see some positive frames perhaps for where the environmental crisis can go, and particularly in light of some of the actions that folks are taking?
Yeah, in my mind, I'm always going to speak from where I feel like I know the most, which is the education side. I know that many people feel that at this moment, climate education maybe isn't going to experience the same support that it has previously. And while I believe that's true, some things that have been making me excited is that we, for example, on our site, we still have increasing amount of users and visitors. So teachers are still teaching about this.
Yeah.
They're still activated to teach about this.
Hmm.
But one thing I think that we're looking at in the future horizon, and I know I'm not sure if I'm directly answering your question, but one thing that's on my mind all the time and our team's mind is that the education landscape is changing and more teachers and districts are leveraging AI tools for resources, for teaching resources. And you know what? That's great. I'm happy. Like, there's Khan Academy with Conmigo, there's Magic School AI. So teachers are going to start generating their own supplementary materials.
Hmm.
So when I think about that and what it means for our organization that provides resources, provides lesson plans, I'm thinking about, well, how do we make sure that when teachers are, maybe less teachers are going to be looking for resources like subject to climate. Well, if that's the case, how do we make it so that they're still embedding environmental concepts with any tool that they're using? And
Hmm.
so I'm also seeing the trend that, people are like searching as if they're talking to ChatGPT now. And so what I mean by that is like, people are getting used to leveraging ChatGPT. So like when you're on our site or any other site, you might not be looking for things like I'm looking for a water lesson plan, so I'll write water. You might be saying, hey, can you please create a water lesson plan for me for third grade? Like we're seeing people like
Yeah.
expecting that. And so
Hmm.
what I'm thinking about for our organization is how do we keep up with how teachers are getting used to teaching and using tools? So that is a space we're exploring. That is a space we're quite excited about while recognizing and then going back to that lesson plan that we are also thinking about how do we leverage AI in a responsible way as well, because we don't want to just put something on our site and just do things that are against our values. But that's definitely on the horizon. And going to ASU+GSV, I've seen a lot of really interesting innovations in AI. So I'm just now taking time with my team to think about, well, as people are creating these innovations, we have a powerful database of vetted climate resources, really wonderful ways to embed project based. You said it's systems thinking. So, how can that
Hmm.
be a part of the tools that teachers are already using?
Amazing stuff. I'm talking with Margaret Wang-Aghania, who is the co-founder and executive director of Subject to Climate, which we've been talking about today. Folks stuck around this long. I think they deserve some takeaways from us, Margaret, and by us, I mean you. So what would be some closing thoughts for folks if they like what they're hearing, but they want to kind of get some actionable takeaways, nuggets for the rest of their lives? What do you want to close with?
Yeah. So I just want to close with that. This is one of the most important things that we as a society has to address climate change. And education is one of the best solutions for it. And so if we can find out how we can support teachers in integrating it into what they are already doing, then I think we're going to be on a right trajectory. So I encourage everybody to check out subjecttoclimate.org, take a look at all these resources, and then feel free to reach out to me if you want to discuss more on how we can truly make this something that every student learns about for their future.
Amazing stuff. And I will say, Margaret, you provided about as many relevant links in real time as any guests I've ever interviewed, which is a credit to you. Hopefully, folks enjoy what they heard. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode.
Thank you so much, Mike.
And subscribe, do all the good things. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.